An Indiana woman and her friend have been charged with murdering the woman's husband using a poisonous mushroom. Katrina Fouts and her friend Terry Hopkins were caught when authorities found cell phone location data and a gold mine of suspicious internet searches that revealed their scheme. David Michael Fouts, a 50-year-old Salesforce employee, was discovered in a Noblesville, Indiana ditch on April 24, 2020, by a dog walker. His pockets were inside out with both wallet and cell phone missing. The Salesforce senior consultant and technology architect also had cuts on his left hand, with 3 abrasions on the right foot, suggesting that he had been dragged after his death. When the autopsy shed no light on the cause of death, Hamilton County Coroner John Shaflan sent samples of mushrooms found in his stomach to a Purdue University specialist. The toxicology report revealed that there were, in fact, several slices of a highly poisonous mushroom Liophyllum conidum in Fouts' stomach. Dr. M. Catherine Aim explained that these mushrooms contain muscarine, a well-known toxin. Muscarine can cause excessive sweating and salivating to lethal symptoms, including slowed heartbeat, respiratory distress, and coma. The symptoms of muscarine poisoning begin about 5 to 30 minutes after ingestion, and a lethal dose of muscarine could come from anywhere between 2 to 15 slices. The reason the autopsy didn't initially show the deadly toxin in the victim's system is because it has a half-life of about 8 hours, and was thus undetectable at first glance. When Hamilton County deputies informed Fouts that her husband had been found dead on April 25th, she immediately responded that her husband was a violent alcoholic and that she feared he had committed suicide. She claimed that when she got home the night before he disappeared, she went to bed on the couch and noticed her husband was gone in the morning. She then claimed that a man had recently come looking for her husband regarding an affair he supposedly had, and that this man said her husband was going to die for his actions, but police cleared these alleged suspects fairly quickly. Investigators remained suspicious of the 54-year-old wife, however, as she never reported her husband missing, nor tried to contact him after his disappearance. Her internet search history ultimately revealed her culpability. Fouts reportedly not only Googled how to pass a lie detector test, but also Indiana homicide laws and crime of passion law in Indiana. Police also found a screenshot of another poisonous mushroom, known as the destroying angel or Amanita virosa. The image was captioned, that is, was among the deadliest plants known to mankind. Police also found a slew of incriminating text messages at around 8:30 a.m. On the morning after her husband was killed, Fouts texted her friend Terry Hopkins and told him, "Thank you for topping off my car fluids last night and taking care of some other things I needed help with." Fouts' friend Hopkins is a retired Richmond police officer and has been a lifelong friend of hers. He reportedly cared for Fouts' ailing father, during which time she nicknamed him Pops. In turn, Hopkins called her MKFAM, an endearing acronym for my kid from another mother. Hopkins made numerous purchases at the Harbor Freight Tools store in the days following the victim's disappearance, including microfiber cleaning clothes, 6-inch diagonal cutters, duct tape, utility knives, box cutters, cleaning gloves, 2 blue tarps, a 500-pound hydraulic lift, white zip ties, and a 6,400-pound lifting sling. Hopkins divided these purchases between 2 different stores to avoid suspicion, but, of course, to no avail. While Fouts and Hopkins have since been charged with murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and failure to report human remains, authorities can only speculate as to their motive. David Fouts was reportedly charged with domestic battery last September. He violated the subsequent no-contact order a few days later, with his court hearing postponed, when he explained that he was in a treatment facility for alcoholism in another state. Both Fouts and Hopkins were being held without bond in the Hamilton County Jail. Then Hamilton County Judge William Hughes sentenced Katrina Fouts to 34 years imprisonment for conspiracy to commit murder and another year in county jail for for failure to report human remains in the killing of David Michael Fouts in April 2022. The sentences will be served simultaneously. Terry Hopkins, 64, was also charged in connection with David Fouts' death. He died in February 2022 before going to trial. The Richmond man faced similar charges of murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and failure to report human remains. On February 24, 1986, 29-year-old Sherri Rasmussen was found dead in her apartment in Van Nuys, California. In a fit of jealous rage, an LAPD officer named Stephanie Lazarus had murdered Rasmussen after her on-again, off-again boyfriend John Ruetten ended their relationship for good and married Rasmussen. Furthermore, the initial investigation of Rasmussen's death is now believed to have been purposely botched by the Los Angeles Police Department to protect Lazarus, one of their own. This is the twisted story behind the murder of Sherri Rasmussen. John Ruetten and Stephanie Lazarus were both students at the University of California, Los Angeles, when they met and were both set to graduate in 1982. Ruetten was a mechanical engineering major, and Lazarus was studying political science. They were also both active and very athletic. Ruetten and Lazarus began a casual relationship, but were not intimate with each other until after graduation. Ruetten took a job as a hardware developer, and Lazarus became a police officer with the LAPD. Though they hooked up a number of times, they never made their relationship official. Later, Ruetten met Sherri Rasmussen, who was quickly rising within the medical field. She was already the director of nursing at Glendale Adventist Medical Center. Rasmussen and Ruetten bonded quickly, and soon moved into an apartment together in Van Nuys. Stephanie Lazarus, meanwhile, had a hard time letting go of Ruetten and made herself something of a third wheel in their relationship, a situation that made Rasmussen uncomfortable. At the 25th birthday party Lazarus threw for Ruetten, he told her about Rasmussen, confessing that they were seriously involved. Lazarus, despondent, wrote a letter to Ruetten's mother in 1985. "I'm truly in love with John, and the past year has really torn me up," she wrote. "I wish it didn't end the way it did, and I don't think I'll ever understand his decision." Ruetten later testified that before he and Rasmussen got married, he and Lazarus had sex one final time so Lazarus could have closure on the relationship. Instead, Lazarus began hanging around even more. Her constant contact with Ruetten worried Sherri Rasmussen, but Ruetten assured her there was nothing more than friendship between them. However, Lazarus' infatuation grew stronger, and at one point she even came to Rasmussen's office to tell her, "If I can't have John, no one else will," though she still worried that Lazarus was stalking her. Rasmussen leaned into Ruetten's assurances, and the pair got married in November of 1985. They had 3 months of marital bliss before tragedy struck. On February 24, 1986, Rasmussen was debating going to work. She had an unexciting class on her schedule and decided to call out sick, using a recent back injury as an excuse. Ruetten left for work soon after. A few hours later, Ruetten called the house. When his call went unanswered, he tried Rasmussen's work, assuming she had decided to go in, but he couldn't reach her there either. He called the house a few more times to no avail. Ruetten tried to ignore his worries and continued his day. But when he got home from work, he found a nightmarish scene. He found the answering machine unactivated even though they activated it every day. He found a bloody handprint next to the panic button near the alarm, and the room was covered in broken objects. John Ruetten then found Sherri Rasmussen dead in the living room. She had been shot 3 times. A Los Angeles PD forensic specialist also found a bite mark on her arm and took a swab. The LAPD quickly ruled Rasmussen was a victim of a burglary. Though neighbors heard screaming and fighting, they did not call the police. Police surmised that the burglar was in the process of carrying out electronics when Rasmussen came upon them and the fight ensued. The police recovered Rasmussen's missing car, and the only other stolen item was the couple's marriage license. Ruetten was ruled out as a suspect and moved from Los Angeles after the murder. Rasmussen's father mentioned his daughter's issues with Lazarus to police, and a note was made, but the lead was never followed up on. Though the bite mark proved to be unusual, the case went cold as no suspect was ever identified. LAPD was too overwhelmed with the growing crack epidemic and related gang violence to dedicate the time needed for the investigation. But Rasmussen's father never believed that his daughter would not have been able to defend herself against a random burglar. Rasmussen's father tried for several years to have the case reopened. Later, detectives refused to do it, and it was not until DNA testing became available that the case gained new traction. A dedicated team at the LAPD worked old forensic cases, using the new technology, and Rasmussen's case was eligible. In 2004, criminalist Jennifer Francis found missing evidence from the file, the cotton swab with DNA on it. The saliva and bite mark were deemed to be female, proving the initial theory of a male burglar was not possible. But no detective took the case, so it again went cold. In 2009, the LAPD reopened the case. It was ruled a murder, with the burglary staged to throw police off the trail. Detectives eventually found Stephanie Lazarus' name in the notes from the original investigation and decided to pursue the lead. They collected DNA from a coffee cup Lazarus threw away while off duty and were able to match it to the sample taken from the bite mark. The evidence proved that Stephanie Lazarus was Rasmussen's killer, and she was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to 27 years to life at the California Institution for Women. She has attempted to appeal her case several times, but the lower courts have upheld the conviction. A state parole board panel in November 2023 recommended parole for Stephanie Lazarus, who was convicted of gunning down her ex-lover's new wife in 1986 at the condominium where the couple lived in Van Nuys. The decision was made during the first parole suitability hearing for Stephanie Lazarus, and Rasmussen's relatives are outraged that the woman who hid the truth about the murder and continued to work as a law enforcement officer for more than 20 years could go free. The grant of parole is tentative and subject to review by the state's Board of Parole Hearings in a process that can take up to 120 days, according to the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. Governor Gavin Newsom could then allow the decision to stand, reverse the parole grant, or ask the full parole board to consider the issue. Connie Rasmussen, Sherri Rasmussen's older sister, said in her family's first interview about the decision that while Lazarus acknowledged killing Sherri during the hearing, she did not apologize to relatives and appeared to downplay the seriousness of the crime, saying that she hadn't intended to kill Sherri when she went to the Van Nuys condo on February 24, 1986. Mother's Day, May 12, 1985, started out like any other day, especially for America's military service members, many of whom were far from their homes and families. Phone calls and cards would have to substitute for visits and hugs while they went about their duties. Gradually, however, these dedicated men and women would learn that a horrifying tragedy had befallen one of their own. The wife and two daughters of Captain Gary Eastburn were found murdered after fighting for their lives. Grown men shed tears at the image of the lone survivor, a 21-month-old baby, standing, arms outstretched, crying out for her dead mother and sisters, crying out for someone. Katie Eastburn was used to going it alone. She was a military wife, after all. Her husband, Gary Eastburn, was frequently away this time. He was attending an Air Force captain in training school in Alabama. The Eastburns were excited about their upcoming transfer to Germany, even if it was a little nerve-wracking thinking about moving to a foreign country. But there was sure to be plenty of support, The military base to which they had been assigned was large and accommodating to its American service members and their families. Katie and the girls knew they'd miss their family and friends, but they were also heartbroken about having to leave their family dog Dixie behind. Strict regulations prohibited them from bringing the pet along. With a heavy heart, Katie placed a classified ad in the local paper that serviced the Fayetteville and Fort Bragg area, hoping to find a good family willing to take Dixie and love the animal just as they did. Around 9 p.m. on Tuesday, May 7, 1985, Army Staff Sergeant Timothy Hennis answered the classified ad. He and his wife, Angela Hennis, loved dogs, but their current pet was extremely jealous of their newborn daughter. Despite their best efforts, Snowball, a mixed breed, just wasn't going to work out. But they hoped they could find another dog, preferably one from a home with kids, which newborn Christina could grow with and enjoy. Dixie seemed to be exactly what Tim and Angela were hoping for. Before he left the Eastburn home, he asked Katie to use the restroom, and she obliged, no doubt comfortable with her husband's fellow soldier. Tim soon exited, thanked Mrs. Eastburn for both the use of facilities and Dixie, attached the dog to a leash, and started toward home, eager to introduce Christina and Dixie. It can't be said with 100% certainty how it all went down on that Thursday, May 9th, 1985. But what is known is that Katie Eastburn and 2 of her 3 daughters would die brutal deaths. On Sunday, May 12th, the Eastburns' next-door neighbor, Army Sergeant Bob Seafelt, had just bailed out one of his soldiers who had a little too much fun on Saturday night and landed himself in the clinker. When he returned home, he was greeted by a worried wife who had noticed that papers were piling up on the Eastburns' doorstep. The family car was still in the driveway, and the baby stroller was parked in its usual place by the back door. The more Bob thought about it, he realized he hadn't seen the Eastburns in at least 3 days. He decided a little investigating was in order. As he stepped up to the front door, he was certain he heard the cries of an infant. But his knocks and doorbell rings went unanswered. Returning home, he called the Eastburns' babysitter, Julie Zerniak, who came rushing over. Bob was waiting outside the Eastburn home when she arrived. Julie peeked into a window and saw baby Jana standing alone in her crib, arms outstretched. Reacting on instinct, Julie began looking for a possible way into the home. But Bob convinced her to wait for the arrival of police. Officer William Toman was the first to arrive. Forcing open a window, he retrieved the crying infant and a stack of diapers and handed her to Bob. Saying he smelled something horrible, he told Bob to stand by as he went to check out the source. Right away, he discovered the dead bodies of Katie and her 3-year-old daughter, Erin. Officer Toman called for backup. A full-scale search of the home found the body of 5-year-old Cara Eastburn, lying in bed with the covers pulled up. Area residents wanted to know, why would anyone kill a beautiful young mother and her 2 daughters? And the bigger question was, who could do such a thing? While investigators searched the home at 367 Summerhill Road for viable clues to identify the killer, a young man named Patrick Cohn reported that he had seen a man leaving the residence 3 nights ago, the night of the murders. Eager to solve the triple homicide, investigators listened intently as Patrick gave his account. I was walking home from my girlfriend's house about 3:30 a.m. as I was walking. I saw a white Chevette parked on the road. Then I saw this white dude walking down the lady's driveway. I passed right by him. He said, "I'm getting an early start this morning," or something like that. Then I watched him get in his white Chevette and drive off. Patrick then went on to provide a thorough description of the man, describing him as approximately 6'4" with blonde hair that peeked out from underneath a black toboggan knit hat, wearing a black members-only jacket atop a white shirt and blue jeans. 3 days after the murders, the police publicly broadcast via television and radio a request for the man who had answered the Eastburns classified ad about the dog to please contact police. The plea was accompanied by a composite sketch created from Patrick Cohn's description. Timothy Hennis was watching the evening news when the investigators' request was reported, and was shaken by the similarities between himself and the composite sketch. Taking his wife and baby girl, Hennis drove to the police department in his white Chevette and offered to assist in any way possible. He willingly answered all of their questions, without the aid of an attorney, and never requested one. It didn't escape police how closely Tim Hennis resembled the sketch, or that he also drove a white Chevette. Although DNA was still a few years away from being used in criminal investigations, police requested hair, blood, and semen samples from Tim. The latter because Katie Eastburn had been raped shortly before her death. Tim willingly obliged, again without the advice of an attorney. Tim and Angela returned to their home, believing they had done all they could do to hopefully bring justice for the Eastman family. So they were shocked when investigators knocked on their door later that evening, with an arrest warrant for Tim. No one involved, not police, Gary, or Janet Eastman, or the Hennises, knew that this case would occupy courtrooms for the next quarter of a century. Timothy Hennis immediately hired the high-profile Fayetteville law firm of Beaver, Holt, Richardson, Sternlicht, Burge, and Glazier. Two of their senior partners, Gary Beaver and Billy Richardson, were considered to be the best criminal defense attorneys in the state of North Carolina. Right out of the starting gate, the firm employed the services of a private investigator, Bob Neligar. His job was to retrace the steps of police detectives, scrutinize the evidence, and look for information or clues police may have missed. Julie, the family's babysitter, was the first to be interviewed. She told Neligar the family residence had recently been the target of harassing phone calls, some of a sexual nature. She admitted to her fascination with Dr. Jeffrey McDonald's case, her belief in his innocence, and her mail exchanges with the convicted murderer. She also admitted to two other important facts. Her stepbrothers strongly resembled Tim Hennis, producing photos when the investigator was skeptical, and that she had been assisting vice squads in setting up busts of local drug dealers. She believed that on one occasion she had been followed from the Eastburn home by an angry drug dealer, although she could not positively identify the man. Secondly, Neligar and the attorneys set up a reenactment of the scene described by Patrick Cohn. Along with a Tim Hennis lookalike, they went to the Summer Hill Road residence at the same early morning hour, with the same foggy and moonless settings, with video camera in hand. The Patrick stand-in was unable to see the Tim actor, as the area was poorly lit during the pre-dawn hours. During the reenactment, David Hill, a neighbor from across the street, approached the team and told them that, on the night of the murder, he had approached a van parked in front of the Eastburn residence. He had spoken to a white male sporting a crew cut who said he had stopped to talk with a couple of friends whose voices David could hear in the back of the van. A couple of days later, David saw the same van for sale in the Winn-Dixie parking lot. At a second reenactment that failed to prove the eyewitness testimony, Patrick, who was present at the request of investigators, admitted that he believed he was mistaken and that he had been having doubts about having fingered Tim Hennis for quite a while. Nigeler also spotted several flaws in the evidence, such as hairs and fingerprints found at the scene that could not be matched to Hennis or any known friend or family member of the Eastburn family. And the size 9 shoe print uncovered by police was entirely too small to match Tim's size, 13 feet. World-renowned forensic expert Paul Stombaugh visited the Eastburn residence 6 months after the crime. There he located a condom package undiscovered by police underneath the dresser. According to Stombaugh, when compared to known facts about the relationship between Mr. and Mrs. Eastburn, this suggested consensual sex had occurred in the home prior to murders, as it was his experience that rapists rarely carried condoms to commit their violent acts. Additionally, after spending several hours in the home and poring over reports and evidence, Stombaugh was of the mind that the murders were committed by 2 assailants. Neligar wrapped up his investigation by speaking with Charlotte Kirby, the newspaper carrier for the Eastburn route. Charlotte was angry at being questioned and refused to provide any information other than it was raining that morning, and she had had to bag the papers. Charlotte agreed to testify, but only if she could do so anonymously. He also spoke with Lucille Cook, who had used her ATM card at the same time and same place as Katie's card had been used. She said she saw no one during her transaction. Lastly, Neligar spoke with Summerhill Road residents, Chuck and Sherri Rasmussen, who claimed to have gone out for an early morning walk at the same time Patrick Cohn said he had seen the man in the white Chevette. According to them, they not only did not see Patrick, but they hadn't seen anyone out at the hour. However, they said that a few nights later, they had indeed witnessed a blonde man with a crew cut, wearing a black beret and black members-only jacket, carrying a black garbage bag over his shoulder, walking down the street at the same time the Eastburn murders would have occurred a few nights before. Police and prosecutors, however, adamantly stuck to their belief in Tim's guilt. They badgered Patrick Cohn about his retracted identification of Tim Hennis, and prosecutor William Van Story argued that just because hair and fingerprint samples didn't match Tim didn't mean he couldn't have committed the crimes. On July 4th, 1986, after 12 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict on 1 count of first-degree rape and 3 counts of first-degree murder. Tim Hennis was sentenced to death 3 times. Just days after being booked into Central Prison in Raleigh, North Carolina, Tim Hennis received a postcard from a mysterious Mr. X that read, "Dear Mr. Hennis, I did the crime. I murdered the Eastburns. Sorry you're doing the time. I'll be safely out of North Carolina when you read this. Thanks, Mr. X." His attorneys dismissed it as a hoax, but kept the postcard on file nonetheless. The prosecution received an almost identical postcard but continued to downplay it, even when specifically requested in discovery motions. Tim's tireless attorneys continued to spend hours preparing and arguing his appeals. After more than 2 years of being on death row, Tim's conviction was overturned and sent back to the courts for a retrial, which began on February 27, 1989. This time, the prosecutor introduced a new witness, Elisa Peabody, a neighbor who had previously stated she saw no one on the night of the murders, but was now adamant that she had in fact seen Tim Hennis leave the scene of the crime. It was of little consequence to the defense, who had come to court this time with both guns blazing. They aggressively took on prosecutor witnesses such as Lucille Cook, the ATM lady who first said no one was at the machine at the time she used it, then later was firm in her memory of Tim Hennis being the person to use it before her. When she testified at the second trial that she remembered Hennis waiting a minute or two before leaving the ATM area, defense attorney used courtroom theatrics to demonstrate the length of a minute or two along with bank record timestamps to prove Lucille was lying. The state's star witness, Patrick Cohn, wasn't exempt from scrutiny when he was forced to admit he had been charged with theft, using a stolen ATM card, but had questionably been able to avoid being brought to trial. Cian Buckner, Patrick's friend, testified to having lost a wallet containing a letter written by his friend in which he admitted he didn't know who or what he really saw on the night of May 9th, 1985. But the defense saved their best for last. With the help of a new private investigator, TV O'Malley, the attorneys were able to locate the mysterious walker seen by Chuck and Sherri Rasmussen, and later by newspaper carrier Charlotte Kirby. Jaws dropped when John Raupash entered the courtroom after being called to the stand. John could have been Tim's identical twin brother. Jurors and spectators were stunned when John testified that he was 6'4", always wore a black members-only jacket, black toboggan, white t-shirt, and dark corduroy pants, and that he always carried his book bag over his shoulder. Following the presentation made by the defense, especially the appearance of John Raupash, it came as no surprise when Tim Hennis was acquitted on all counts. If Tim Hennis felt free after his acquittal in 1989, this was premature. In 2007, Army officials reopened the case after experts claimed they had linked DNA from the 22-year-old murder to Tim. By this time, 49-year-old Tim had retired from the military, but was forcefully reactivated to stand trial under military jurisdiction. Double jeopardy prevented state officials from retrying Tim. Even with the discovery of new evidence, the federal government is considered a sovereign authority unto itself and therefore separate from powers of the states. Although Tim initially stuck to his story of only visiting the Eastburns to claim the dog listed in the classifieds, he later claimed that he and Katie had consensual sex the night of the murder. He did not disclose this important fact before, because, according to Tim, he was afraid and did not wish to add to Gary and Jana Eastburn's grief. The military jury rejected Tim's claims and on April 9, 2010, found him guilty on 3 counts of premeditated murder. Tim Hennis is currently on death row in an Army facility in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. His attorneys are presently working on his appeals, which are expected to go on for years. In 2020, the United States Court of Military Appeals ruled to uphold the conviction and death sentence of Timothy Hennis. That same year, Hennis' attorneys filed a writ for certiorari with the U.S. Supreme Court, but it was denied in January 2021. Even after the appeals process is over, Hennis cannot be executed without presidential approval. In recent years, that hasn't happened very often. The U.S. military has not executed anyone from its ranks since 1961. On June 28, 2014, Erin Corwin disappeared from her home near Joshua Tree National Park in California. Right up until that fateful day, her life seemed happy, at least from the outside. The 19-year-old Corwin was newly pregnant and had recently married her high school sweetheart, John Corwin, a decorated Marine. But beneath the surface of the expectant mother's seemingly idyllic life was a secret, one that would prove deadly in the end. The baby she was carrying didn't belong to her husband, but instead to her longtime secret lover, Christopher Brandon Lee. And after she vanished, and her body was found at the bottom of a mine shaft a week later, it was Lee who would ultimately confess to her murder. This is the tragic true story of Erin Corwin, the young woman whose secret affair cost her her life. Born Erin Hevelin in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, Erin Corwin lived a stereotypically all-American life. She met her future husband, John Corwin, when she was still in high school. They began dating when Erin was just 16 years old, and in proper fashion, John even asked permission from Erin's parents before officially dating her. In November 2012, the pair were married. Less than a year later, in September 2013, John and Erin Corwin lighted out to the Marine base in 29 Palms, California, best known as the home of Joshua Tree National Park. There, the couple quickly became friends with other military couples, including Connor and Aisling Malachi, and Christopher Brandon Lee and his wife Nicole. And it didn't take long for the 3 pairs of couples to become friends. While their husbands were on duty, Erin, Aisling, and Nicole would stop by each other's apartments for snacks and gossip, wrote Shanna Hogan in her book, Secrets of a Marine's Wife. When John, Connor, and Chris were home, the couples barbecued on the grill outside their complex, or watched movies and TV shows at each other's apartments. Despite this seemingly idyllic rhythm, it didn't take long for things to go horribly wrong for everyone involved. Like many newlywed couples, John and Erin Corwin frequently argued over money. They would often accuse the other of overspending, and their disagreements would often end in screaming matches. But when Erin got pregnant for the first time, the fighting seemed to stop until she miscarried shortly after discovering she was pregnant. With John unable to console his clearly devastated wife, the Corwins began to drift further apart. The Lees, too, were going through trials and tribulations of their own. While Christopher Brandon Lee, on the surface, seemed to be a perfect candidate for the Marine Corps. The reality was much different. At least once, he was reprimanded by a commanding officer for using the rifles and rocket launchers like they were toys. Over time, Chris gained a reputation for being rash and reckless, wrote Hogan. Erin Corwin and Christopher Lee began spending more time together, away from the rest of the group, and away from the watchful eyes of their respective spouses. Before long, the pair were having an affair, and Erin turned up pregnant again. But this time, the baby belonged to her lover, not her husband. On the last day anyone would see her alive, John Corwin recalled the brief but loving conversation he had with his wife. He said, "She had woken up and gotten dressed and gave me a kiss goodbye. She said, 'Hey, I'm heading out for the day and I love you.' I told her, 'I love you too,' and I rolled back over and went to sleep." On June 28, 2014, Erin Corwin disappeared, never to be seen alive again. Shortly thereafter, Christopher Brandon Lee took his wife and daughter to Alaska, where they presumably wanted to live for the rest of their lives. Initially, Erin's mother believed her daughter may have just gotten lost in the vastness of the Joshua Tree National Park, but quickly disabused herself of the notion when Erin's abandoned car was found outside the park a week later. It took 2 months for Erin's body to be recovered, which would ultimately prove to be down an abandoned mine shaft, strangled to death with a handmade garrote. Though Erin Corwin told her friends and family she was pregnant, and that Lee was the father, her body was so badly decomposed that the medical examiner could not confirm her pregnancy. Shortly after her body was found, Christopher Brandon Lee was arrested in Alaska in August 2014. While he initially pleaded not guilty to the crime, he eventually confessed to killing his former lover in August 2016, but insisted that it was because she was molesting his daughter, a claim that has never been substantiated. "I made the decision to kill her," he said. "I was controlled by the anger. The hate I felt that day, it was something I never want to experience again." In November 2016, Christopher Brandon Lee was found guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Erin Corwin. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Lee appealed his case in 2018, but the California Supreme Court denied it outright, citing Lee's false claim of molestation as their reasoning. He remains behind bars to this day. For most people, September 13, 1978 was an ordinary Wednesday. But for Cheryl Bradshaw, the bachelorette on the TV matchmaking show The Dating Game, that day was momentous. From a lineup of eligible bachelors, she chose handsome bachelor number 1, Rodney Alcala, aka the Dating Game Killer. But at that very moment, he was keeping a deadly secret. He was an unrepentant serial killer. If not for a healthy jolt of women's intuition, Bradshaw would almost certainly be remembered today as one of Alcala's victims. Instead, after the show ended, she conversed with Alcala backstage. He offered her a date she'd never forget, but Bradshaw got the feeling that her handsome potential suitor was a little off. "I started to feel ill," Bradshaw told the Sydney Telegraph in 2012. "He was acting really creepy. I turned down his offer. I didn't want to see him again." Another one of the episode's bachelors, actor Jed Mills, recalled to LA Weekly that Rodney was kind of quiet. "I remember him because I told my brother about this one guy who was kind of good-looking, but kind of creepy. He was always looking down and not making eye contact." Had the popular dating show performed background checks on their bachelors, they would have discovered that this kind of good-looking but kind of creepy guy had already spent 3 years in prison for raping and beating an 8-year-old girl. He'd done the same to a 13-year-old too, which landed him on the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list. But sometimes a background check can't even uncover the whole story. In Rodney Alcala's case, the whole story consisted of at least 4 prior murders that he hadn't been definitively linked to yet. As you can probably imagine, Cheryl Bradshaw's rejection likely only fueled Alcala's fire. In total, before and after his television appearance, the sadistic dating game killer claimed that he killed between 50 and 100 people. Rodney Alcala was born in San Antonio, Texas in 1943. His father moved the family to Mexico when Alcala was 8 years old, only to abandon them there 3 years later. His mother then moved Alcala and his sister to suburban Los Angeles. At age 17, Alcala entered the army as a clerk, but after a nervous breakdown, he was medically discharged due to mental health issues. Then, the intelligent young man with an IQ of 135 went on to attend UCLA. But he wouldn't stay on the straight and narrow for long. Like many serial killers, Rodney Alcala had a style. His signatures were beating, biting, raping, and strangling, often choking victims until the point of unconsciousness. Then once they came to, he'd start the process over again. On his first known attempt at killing, he was successful at only 2 of these things. The victim was Tali Shapiro, an 8-year-old girl he lured into his Hollywood apartment in 1968. Shapiro barely survived her rape and beating, her life saved by a passerby who'd reported a tip to police on a possible abduction. Alcala fled his apartment when the police arrived and remained a fugitive for years afterward. He moved to New York and used the alias John Berger to enroll in film school at New York University, where, ironically enough, he studied under Roman Polanski. After being recognized thanks to an FBI poster, Alcala was finally identified as the perpetrator in the rape and attempted murder of Tali Shapiro. He was arrested in 1971, but only sent to prison on charges of assault. Shapiro's family kept her from testifying, making a rape conviction unattainable. After spending 3 years behind bars, he soon spent another 2 years in prison for assaulting a 13-year-old girl. Then, authorities regrettably let Alcala travel to New York to visit relatives. Investigators now believe that within 7 days of his arrival there, he killed a college student named Elaine Hover, who was the daughter of a popular Hollywood nightclub owner and goddaughter of both Sammy Davis Jr. and Dean Martin. Soon after all of this, Alcala somehow got a job at the Los Angeles Times as a typesetter in 1978, under his real name, which was now attached to a substantial criminal record. A typist by day, by night he lured in young girls to be part of his professional photography portfolio, some of them never to be heard from again. Now go back and listen to Alcala tell Bachelorette Bradshaw the best time is at night. Absolutely chilling stuff. The year after the dating game appearance, 17-year-old Leanne Leadham was lucky enough to walk away unscathed from a photo shoot with Rodney Alcala, and she remarked how he showed her his portfolio, which in addition to shots of women included spread after spread of naked teenage boys. Police have since released parts of Alcala's portfolio to the public to aid in victim identification. Over the years, a few have stepped forward to reveal their horrifying moment with this predator. The case that would finally break Rodney Alcala's killing spree was that of 12-year-old Robin Samsoe. She disappeared from Huntington Beach, California on her way to ballet class on June 20th, 1979. Samsoe's friends said that a stranger approached them on the beach and asked if they'd want to do a photo shoot. They declined and Samsoe left, borrowing a friend's bike to hurriedly get to ballet. At some point between the beach and class, Samsoe disappeared. Nearly 12 days later, a park ranger found her animal-ravaged bones in a forested area near the Pasadena foothills of the Sierra Madre. Upon questioning Samsoe's friends, a police sketch artist drew up a composite, and Alcala's former parole officer recognized the face. Between the sketch, Alcala's criminal past, and the discovery of Samsoe's earrings in Alcala's Seattle storage locker, police felt confident that they had their man. But beginning with the trial in 1980, Samsoe's family would have to follow a rather long and winding road to justice. The jury found Alcala guilty of first-degree murder, and he received the death penalty. However, the California Supreme Court overturned this verdict due to the jury being prejudiced. They felt, by learning of Alcala's past sex crimes. It took 6 years to put him back on trial. At the second trial in 1986, another jury sentenced him to death. This one didn't stick either. A Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals panel overturned it in 2001. LA Weekly wrote, in part because the second trial judge did not allow a witness to back up the defense's claim that the park ranger who found Robin Samsoe's animal-ravaged body in the mountains had been hypnotized by police investigators. Finally, in 2010, 31 years after the murder, a third trial was held. Just before the trial, Orange County's senior deputy district attorney, Matt Murphy, stated, "The 70s in California was insane as far as treatment of sexual predators. Rodney Alcala is a poster boy for this. It is a total comedy of outrageous stupidity." During the years he spent incarcerated, Alcala self-published a book called You, the jury in which he proclaimed his innocence in the Samsoe case. He hotly contested the DNA swabs done on prisoners periodically for the police department's evidence bank. Alcala also brought 2 lawsuits against the California penal system, one for a slip and fall accident, and another for the prison's refusal to provide him with a low-fat menu. Alcala announced, to much surprise, that he would be his own lawyer in his third trial. Even though now, 31 years after Samsoe's murder, investigators also had concrete evidence against him on 4 different murders from decades past, thanks to the prison's DNA swabs. The prosecution was able to combine these new murder charges along with Robin Samsoe in the 2010 trial. During the 2010 trial, the jurors were in for a bizarre ride. Rodney Alcala, acting as his own attorney, asked himself questions, referring to himself as Mr. Alcala in a deep voice, which he would then answer. The peculiar question and answer session continued for 5 hours. He told the jury that he was at Knott's Berry Farm at the time of Samsoe's murder, played dumb on the other charges, and used an Arlo Guthrie song as part of his closing argument. Rodney Alcala simply stated that he didn't remember killing the other women. The only other witness for the defense, psychologist Richard Rappaport, offered the explanation that Alcala's memory lapse could be equated to his borderline personality disorder. The jury, not surprisingly, found Alcala guilty of the 4 DNA-backed charges and also found him guilty of killing Samsoe. A surprise witness at his sentencing was Tali Shapiro, the girl that Alcala had raped and beaten within an inch of her life about 40 years before. Shapiro was there to witness as justice for Robin Samsoe, 12, Jill Barcombe, 18, Georgia Wickstead, 27, Charlotte Lamb, 31, and Jill Parenteau, 21, had finally been achieved. The court handed Alcala the death penalty again for the 3rd time. Since that trial, investigators have continued to link the dating game killer to many other cold case murders, including 2 to which he pled guilty in New York in 2013. The full extent of his crimes may never be known. While still sitting on death row in California, Rodney Alcala died of natural causes at age 77 on July 24, 2021. Immediately, some of his victims spoke up, expressing their relief that the dating game killer was finally truly gone. "The planet is a better place without him, that's for sure," said Tali Shapiro. "It's a long time coming, but he's got his karma." Investigator Jeff Sheeman, who had been working on a cold case involving Alcala in Wyoming in recent years, was even more blunt, saying, "He's where he needs to be, and I'm sure that's in hell." Sheeman recalled that, during interviews with police, Alcala would trace his finger along the faces of his victims in the photographs put before him, perhaps in hopes that it would irritate and even enrage the detectives. Throughout his investigation, Sheeman was overcome with just how cold Alcala was, and ultimately came to believe that he may have taken untold scores of victims that we'll never know about. Sheeman said after Alcala's death. Hell, there might be a ton of other victims out there. When Kelly Cochran's husband found out about her affair, he asked her a simple question that had unimaginably gruesome consequences. How would she make up for it? Jason Cochran was satisfied with the answer. He would forgive his wife of 13 years if she lured her lover to their house with the promise of sex, and then allowed her jealous husband to blow the lover's brains out. Kelly Cochran's co-worker and fling, Christopher Regan, was fatally caught off guard. He was mid-coitus when Jason Cochran emerged from the shadows to execute him at point-blank range with a .22 rifle. Moments later, Kelly Cochran was handing her husband a buzzsaw with which to dismember him. Little did Jason know that he would be next. Kelly grew resentful of the 2014 incident and later killed him with a heroin overdose to even the score in 2016. When holes in her story led to her arrest, she claimed Regan's murder was born out of a lethal marital pact. This is the grisly story of Kelly Cochran. Born and raised in Merrillville, Indiana, Kelly and Jason Cochran were high school sweethearts who grew up next door to each other. They were so enamored with each other that they were married after Kelly Cochran graduated from high school in 2002 and made a lifelong promise to kill anyone who they might cheat with. Jason Cochran worked hard servicing swimming pools until his back gave out after 10 years of physical labor. While his wife tried to pay the bills, the debts kept piling up. The couple left Indiana for Caspian, Michigan, in 2013, also looking forward to legal marijuana, which would help ease Jason's chronic pain. Kelly Cochran met Christopher Regan at a factory job manufacturing naval ship parts. An Air Force veteran and Detroit native, he and Cochran bonded and became lovers despite their 20-year age difference. Through his relationship with Cochran, Regan was also cheating on his girlfriend, Terry O'Donnell. They finally agreed to patch things up the day that he died. On October 14, 2014, Chris Regan planned to spend the night with Kelly Cochran, unaware she had spent the previous night arguing with her husband about him. Knowing it meant her lover's death, Cochran invited him over and had sex with him as her husband shot him in the head. Neighbors heard a shot, then power tools. O'Donnell reported Regan missing 10 days later, but the Cochrans had already dumped his remains in the woods. While they parked his car on the outskirts of town, they failed to notice a post-it note with directions to their house inside. Police were more observant and found the car, the note inside, and their suspects. Police paid Jason and Kelly Cochran a visit, finding the former entirely at ease and the latter uncomfortable. They later questioned them separately. Kelly admitted to having an affair with Regan, but claimed she and her husband had an open marriage. Jason, meanwhile, appeared rather aggravated at her infidelity. While the Cochrans had managed to remove all evidence of their crimes and the case went cold, an FBI search of their home in March 2015 prompted the terrified couple to leave town for Hobart, Indiana. It was there, on February 20th, 2016, that suspicions got the better of the couple, and Cochran murdered her husband. When EMTs arrived at the Mississippi Street residence, they found Jason Cochran unresponsive, and Kelly was reportedly disruptive as they attempted to revive him. The EMTs declared Cochran's husband dead of an overdose, unaware that she had deliberately overloaded his heroin fix, then smothered him for good measure. Cochran held a memorial service days later, claiming it was the hardest thing I will ever have to deal with online, while pawning off her belongings. She fled Indiana on April 26th without notifying relatives, and when the Hobart medical examiner realized Jason died of asphyxiation, she became a fugitive. With probable cause, authorities charged her with murder, home invasion, conspiracy to commit bodies, disinterment and mutilation, concealing the death of an individual, lying to a police officer, and accessory to murder after the fact. Even though she was on the run, Cochran unwisely kept in touch with investigators via text. Her messages claimed she was hiding out on the West Coast in an attempt to throw police off course. However, they simply tracked her phone to Wingo, Kentucky, where U.S. Marshals arrested her on April 29. Finally, Cochran pointed cops to Regan's remains and the murder weapon. Kelly Cochran's trial revealed that she contemplated killing Jason instead of Chris. She felt that he had killed the only good thing I had in my life, adding, "I still hate him." And yes, it was revenge. I evened the score. While serving a life sentence for Christopher Regan's death, she earned another 65 years in April 2018 for killing her husband. Police said she only told her spouse about Regan when he declined a serious relationship, as the diabolical pact would ensure his death. Ultimately, the full extent of Kelly Cochran's crimes only began to reveal themselves while she was in prison. Once news got out that the couple had dismembered Christopher Regan, friends and neighbors came to the stomach-churning revelation that they had very likely eaten Regan's barbecued remains at a cookout hosted by Cochran. Prosecutors also claimed that Cochran had boasted in interviews to killing several other people, and that she may well be a serial killer with up to 9 bodies buried across the Midwest. Regardless, Kelly Cochran will spend the rest of her life behind bars. Angel Maturino Resendiz hopped on and off freight trains to target victims he found close to the railroad. His attacks were distinctive for their brutal blows to victims' heads, often caused by objects found in the victims' own homes. Known as the Railroad Killer, he was at one point the FBI's most wanted fugitive. The FBI linked the Railroad Killer to at least 15 murders across several states in the 1990s, and only one woman survived to tell the tale after being beaten, raped, and left for dead. And after Angel Maturino, Resendiz escaped capture several times by being voluntarily deported back to Mexico, it would take the combined effort of an FBI task force and the Railroad Killer's own sister to finally bring him to justice in 1999. Resendiz was born on August 1, 1959, in Puebla, Mexico, as Angel Leoncio Reyes Resendiz. At age 14, he illegally entered Florida before being deported in 1976. In fact, over a 20-year period, Resendiz was deported or voluntarily returned to Mexico 17 times, having illegally entered the U.S. using a series of aliases. Convicted on at least 9 occasions for serious felonies, including burglary, Resendiz would be deported after he served his sentence, then head right back to the U.S. to resume his criminal activities. Drifting back and forth across the border, Resendiz illegally hopped freight trains while working seasonal migrant farm jobs, riding rail cars to Florida for orange picking season or up to Kentucky to harvest tobacco. In 1986, Resendiz killed his first victim, an unidentified homeless woman in Texas, according to the Houston Chronicle. But it wasn't until Resendiz killed 2 teenage runaways in 1997 near railroad tracks in Central Florida that investigators linked those slayings to his previous crimes and realized that they had a serial killer on their hands. On the night of August 29, 1997, in Lexington, Kentucky, young couple Christopher Meyer and Holly Dunn were walking along railway tracks back to a party near the University of Kentucky when Resendiz suddenly emerged from a crouched position behind a metal electrical box, binding the terrified couple's hands and feet and gagging Meyer. Resendiz wandered off, then came back with a large rock, which he dropped on Meyer's head. Resendiz raped Dunn, who stopped struggling when he reportedly told her just how easy it would be for him to kill her. Left viciously beaten by a large object and suffering multiple facial fractures, Dunn became the lone survivor of the Railroad Killer. Resendiz continued riding the rails and committing murders across several states, with the ferocity of his attacks increasing with each stop. His murder spree was only interrupted when he was detained by the Immigration and Naturalization Service. But once he was free, his killings continued anew. After having beaten 2 elderly women to death in their Texas and Georgia homes, Resendiz entered the Texas home of Claudia Benton late at night on December 17, 1998. Benton was soon found beaten to death with a statue in her bedroom, and Resendiz was far from finished. On May 2, 1999, he entered the Weimar, Texas, home of a pastor and his wife. In their house, situated behind the church and near the railroad tracks, Resendiz beat Norman and Karen Cernick to death with a sledgehammer as they slept, then sexually assaulted Karen. The search for Resendiz received widespread national media attention, even appearing on an episode of America's Most Wanted. The FBI saw similarities between the Benton and Cernick murder scenes, and DNA obtained from both came back as a match. The connected crime scenes were entered into VICAP, the nationwide data information center that collects and analyzes information on violent crimes. The Kentucky murder of Christopher Meyer, which Holly Dunn miraculously survived, seemed to match aspects of the murders of Benton and the Cernicks, and the DNA once again matched as well. The FBI then obtained a federal warrant for Resendiz's arrest in late May 1999 and formed a multi-agency task force to apprehend him. Over an 18-month period, the Immigration and Naturalization Service detained the railroad killer 9 times, but, hiding behind fabricated identities, he was voluntarily returned to Mexico on each occasion. But the Immigration and Naturalization Service's gravest error came on the night of June 1, 1999, according to Justice Department documents, when the railroad killer was detained entering the U.S. in the desert near the Santa Teresa border crossing in New Mexico. Resendiz provided an unused alias and a different date of birth, and with authorities unaware, there was a warrant for his arrest in connection with several murders. Resendiz was voluntarily returned to Mexico the following day. 2 days later, the railroad killer re-entered Texas and savagely committed 4 more murders over the course of just 12 days. On June 4th, the railroad killer killed 2 people in 1 day, sexually assaulting Houston schoolteacher Noemi Dominguez before murdering her with a pickaxe. In her stolen car, Resendiz traveled to Schulenburg, Texas, around 4 miles from Weimar, and the previous Cernick killings. In Schulenburg, he used that same pickaxe to kill 73-year-old Josephine Konvicka, leaving the weapon embedded in Konvicka's head. Moving north, Resendiz next invaded the home of 80-year-old George Morber, just 100 yards from a railroad track in Gorham, Illinois. The railroad killer shot Morber in the back of the head with a shotgun before Morber's 57-year-old daughter, Carolyn Frederick, arrived. And Resendiz didn't spare Frederick, beating her to death, then sexually assaulting her afterward. As dread escalated across communities easily reachable by train, Resendiz was placed on the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list. The FBI task force was stunned to find that Angel Maturino Resendiz had been rounded up and deported 8 times in a mere 18 months. Most unbelievably, on June 2, 1999, when state and federal warrants were out and intensive efforts were underway to catch him. Behind the scenes, the railroad killer's sister worked with Texas Ranger Drew Carter by encouraging her brother to give himself up. She was later awarded $86,000 for aiding in his surrender. On July 13, 1999, Resendiz, accompanied by family, surrendered on an El Paso border crossing bridge, shaking Ranger Carter's hand. The railroad killer's innocuous 5-foot, 190-pound appearance belied the monstrous acts he'd committed. Resendiz was evaluated as mentally disturbed, but not insane at trial, and on May 18, 2000, with survivor Holly Dunn having testified, was convicted for the capital murder of Claudia Benton, having also confessed to 8 other murders. Resendiz was sentenced to death, following an automatic appeal. On the day of his execution, he asked forgiveness from the family members of his victims in attendance, and from God, for allowing the devil to deceive me, with his final words stating, "I deserve what I am getting." The railroad killer died by lethal injection on June 27, 2006. If you enjoyed the video, please show your support by subscribing and liking the video, and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any future uploads.